Well, I hope your new year has started out well. That your favorite football team won? No, there are some people just having a hard time of it since their team lost. But I hope that even with that, your year is going to be good. If you'll notice on your bulletin, did everybody get a bulletin here today? On the front of your bulletin, do you see a word there sort of in the background? What is that word? Worship. Worship. That's what I want to talk with you about today. I found some comments by children that they had about their worship time. Here are a few of them. This one's from Wendy. These are kids probably between 6 and 10, something like that. Wendy said, "I wonder in how many places the light can really be." And she put capital L, light. Didn't Jesus say, "I am the light of the world"? Matthew said, "What was it like when Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt?" Whitney said, "Why did people kill Jesus?" That's a pretty tough question, isn't it? Ashley said, "If the characters are happy or sad." Hope said, "When I was younger, I wondered about how the people who wrote the books of the Bible wrote so fast, or how they could fit time in to do it." Nicole said, "If the people look like real people today." Caleb said, "Sometimes if they are taking a journey, I wonder how long the journey would be." Leanne said, "I wonder how the people who found the stories in other languages decoded them." And then Crystal said, "Did Moses really think God was in the burning bush? Or did he lack faith? What did it feel like to be in the presence of God?" Oh, that's pretty good, isn't it? What did it feel like to be in the presence of God? Well, that's worship, being in the presence of God. Let me give you this definition of worship that has stayed with me for a long, long time. It's from William Temple. He was a theologian in his book called Nature, Man, and God. And here is how he defined worship. To worship is to quicken the conscience by the holiness of God, to feed the mind with the truth of God, to purge the imagination by the beauty of God, to open the heart to the love of God, and to devote the will to the purpose of God. Isn't that interesting? He covers our conscience, our mind, our imagination, our heart, and our will. True worship, authentic worship, touches all those aspects of who we are. And today I want to talk with you about authentic worship. Now, the journalistic world today is grappling with what is the definition of news. Have you heard the phrase lately? That's fake news. You heard that? There was a political cartoon in the paper the other day. One was a Republican reporter and a Democratic reporter, of course, in the elephant and the donkey thing. And they're both pointing fingers at each other and saying, "That's fake news." Fake news. Well, I drummed up some fake news when I was a kid. You ever done this? I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I told a little friend in my kindergarten class that Saturday was going to be my birthday. And I forgot all about it. You know how kids are when you're 5 or 6 years old. Well, on Saturday, we were living in Alaska at Ladd Air Force Base at the time, and Mom and Dad, we went somewhere. When we came back that afternoon, a neighbor said, Jimmy, that's my mom's name, there was a little boy sitting on your steps for about an hour or two this afternoon. He had a present with him. Mom came in. She said, Mike, do you know anything about that? And then I remembered. Oh, I said, Mom, I told him that it was my birthday. She said, well, you know it's not your birthday. I said, well, I know. I just made it up. That didn't go over too well with my mom. I just made up some fake news. We certainly don't want to have any fake in our worship, do we? We want to have authentic worship. And as we look at this text today and several others, I want to point out to you and to me some aspects of authentic worship. Let's take a look at Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Right about the middle of your Bible, if you have the full Bible, it'll be past Psalms and Proverbs. If you find Psalms, just go a little bit to the right, and you'll eventually come to Isaiah chapter 6. Normally, this is called Isaiah's call or commissioning. Some say it's his vision of the Lord, and it very much is. But Isaiah experienced the presence of God, and that's what we're after, to be worshipers of the Lord. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Here is the first aspect of authentic worship, is that it draws us. Authentic worship draws us. In the year that King Uzziah died. Now, Judah had a few good kings and a lot of bad ones through the years. Israel was the same way. But Uzziah was one of those good kings. And when he passed away, it made Isaiah sad. And in that sadness, he comes to the temple. And there is something about authentic worship that draws you and me. It draws us. Anthropologists tell us that most every culture or society worships something outside of themselves. This confirms what the Bible teaches about humankind. Listen to Ecclesiastes 3:11. God has put eternity into man's heart. It's almost like we are created with a desire to worship in our hearts. Augustine, the great theologian of the 3rd and 4th century, said, "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." Isaiah's heart was sad because the king had died, and he reached out of himself toward God. There was something within him that pulled him, that drew him to worship. That's what authentic worship does. It draws us to God. I want you to hear, you don't have to turn to it if you want to take a note. It's 1 Samuel 1, and I want to read to you of another person, a lady, who experienced the presence of God. Her name is Hannah, and she did not have any children. And she went with her husband up to Shiloh, where the tabernacle was. This was before the temple was built. And here's her story. After they had eaten and drank in Shiloh, Hannah rose up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. Isn't that interesting? In her distress, she's praying to the Lord. There's that drawing again. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli, now he's a real perceptive priest. He took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way, and she ate, and her face was no longer sad. Authentic worship draws us. This means that burdens that we have, concerns, questions, disappointments, hurts, injustices, we can bring these things to worship, and something authentic can happen. Authentic worship draws us. But back in Isaiah, verses 1 through verse 4, he says, when King Uzziah died, he saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Now, I think the old King James says the train of his temple. And, you know, as a little boy, when I read that, I just see God having a train in the temple, just running it around like that. Really, the hem of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, 2 he covered his feet, with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Here's a second aspect of worship. Authentic worship opens us. It opens us. As we look at these brief verses, there's not a whole lot of description about the person of God here. Not very much at all. It's very spare. Because human language does not have the ability to express the full character of God. Just doesn't have it. But we notice some things. We notice it opens us up to his majesty. Notice Isaiah saw him seated on a throne. Seated on a throne. His majesty. And he's surrounded with angels, seraphim, created beings that are there to do his bidding. Not to argue among themselves, but to do his bidding. So it opens us up. Authentic worship opens us up to God's majesty. Also his transcendence. He's high and lifted up, high and exalted. This refers to the fact that God is holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y, other than humanity. He is wholly other than us. He's high and lifted up. This is one of the struggles that modern day evangelicalism has about God. We have pulled God down and sat him on our shoulder, and we just sort of listen to him natter away in our ear. No, not at all. He is high and exalted, high and lifted up. It opens us up to his holiness. Did you hear the seraphim? Holy, holy, holy. The holiness of God is mentioned over 800 times in the Old Testament. This thrice saying says it is perfect. It is complete, his holiness. But it opens us up also to his immanence. The whole earth is full of his glory. There are these things about God. He is transcendent. He is wholly other than us, but he's also immanent. He is present with his creation. Immanent, present, here. The whole earth is full of his glory. And it opens us up to his power. It says, and the foundations of the threshold shook. Perhaps we need to pass out crash helmets instead of bulletins when we come to worship. What does that look like in a person's life? Well, it takes on a variety of things. Let me share with you about Moses in Exodus chapter 3. You don't have to turn there. I will read it for you. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, he's not in a temple. He's out on the backside of a desert. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Moses was scared stupid. Sometimes we think if we really are authentic in our worship to God, we're just jumping up and down, jumping the pews and hanging from the chandeliers and shouting, glory, hallelujah. Moses, when he experienced the presence of God, was afraid. He hid his face. Moses was shook to his foundations. Authentic worship will do that to us. Because we put up so many foundations in our life. We can just put up good health and a fine portfolio and all those things. We think our foundations are secure. Authentic worship opens us. I don't know if you've ever been to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. How many of you have seen that? A lot of you have. My first and only experience there was different than what I thought it would be. If you've not been there, it's black marble. I'm not exactly sure. It's quality stuff. And the names of all the men and women who lost their lives in Vietnam are on that memorial. Starts off on level ground, and then slowly it descends. And the wall gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you go lower and lower and lower. There was one man, African American, older man, standing to the side, and he was weeping. And I stood beside that man. I didn't say a word. And I started to weep too. And I had not lost anybody in the war. Authentic worship opens us to the God of majesty. There's another aspect. This authentic worship reduces us. In verse 5, notice Isaiah's response. He didn't jump up and down and shout from the top of his lungs, "Glory, glory, glory." Here's what he said. "Woe is me! Woe is me! I'm in trouble. For I am undone, I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Authentic worship reduces us. God becomes great, and we become small. Have you ever experienced that? Skiing in Canada did that for me more than once. When you get up, when you're 5,000 or 6,000 feet or more above sea level on those mountains, and I remember a particular day that the snow was just coming down very softly. And the only thing you could hear on the side of the mountain was the shh, shh, shh of the skis as you went down the mountainside. And I looked around at those mountains and the snow coming down, how quiet it was, and I became very small, and realized afresh how big God is. I experienced something similar at the Lincoln Memorial. You ever been there? You walk up these marble steps, and there is Abraham Lincoln sitting in the chair, larger than life, and big columns going up, and the Gettysburg Address there in the background. And the more I went up the steps, the smaller I felt. You see, authentic worship reduces us. We realize the depth of our sinfulness. Isaiah said, "I am a man of unclean lips." And the extent of that sinfulness as it reaches out and covers the wide world. And I dwell in the land of a people of unclean lips. It reduces us. Listen to Job's experience. Let me read that to you. In the very last chapter of the book of Job, Job has been speaking, and his friends have been speaking. Finally, God speaks. 3 chapters, that's it. There are 42 chapters in this book. God gets 3. And then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is it that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Authentic worship reduces us because God becomes great and we become small. There's another aspect. Authentic worship cleanses us. In verses 6 and 7, it says one of the seraphim, Isaiah feels like he is done for. It's over for him. But that's not the case. One of the seraphim flew to him, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Authentic worship cleanses us. Here, he's talking about the altar of sacrifice, where a bull or a lamb was offered. And this angel, this seraphim, takes a burning coal from off that altar and applies it to his lips. You see, the lips are the mouthpiece of the heart. Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Guilt is taken away and our sin atoned for. Listen to David. Let me read this one for you. Psalm 32. David wrote this. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Tell you what, that's very important. Augustine, probably one of the greatest theologians the Christian church has ever had, when he lay dying, and he did not die right away, he lingered. He had one of his friends to take some paint, some chalk, something, to write on the wall opposite of where his bed was. His eyes were dimming because of his age, and he had that helper write, Blessed is the one whose transgression is covered. Authentic worship cleanses us. When we encounter the presence of God, He cleans us up. He makes us presentable again. But finally, authentic worship calls us. Back in Isaiah, that last little part, verse 8. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. Authentic worship calls us. We do not leave worship, true worship, the same. God calls us to a task, to something. And the full personhood of God is behind this call. Did you notice? He says, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" God in his full personality, Father, Son, and Spirit, is behind this. And usually his call is connected to an unmet need or a call for help. Listen to another person who experienced this. Jeremiah, chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to me. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, "O Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth." But the Lord said to me, "Don't say that. Don't say I'm only a youth, for all to whom I send you, you will go. And whatever I command you, you shall speak. Don't be afraid of them." That's one of the biggest issues we have. We're afraid of people. We're afraid of what they might think or what they might say or how they're going to treat us. We're afraid of them. God understands that. He knows all about it. Don't be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord put his hand and touched my mouth. There it is again. And the Lord said to me, "Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have set you this day over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy, to overthrow, to build, and to plant." Authentic worship calls us. And as I said, it's usually connected to an unmet need or a call for help. God needed Jeremiah to go and say to his people, "Come back to me, return to me, O ye lands." There was a call, an unmet need. Over the Christmas holidays, I went to a movie with a couple of our guys in our church, Art Wilson and his son Buddy, to see the movie Hacksaw Ridge. Now, most of you ladies, I would imagine you wouldn't want to see this movie. It's a true story, World War II, Okinawa in the Pacific. And it's about a fellow by the name of Desmond Doss, young man from Lynchburg, Virginia. And he volunteered for the Army. But because of his religious conviction, he did not want to shoot anybody. And they tried to run him out of the Army. An army is supposed to shoot people. But eventually, they let him become a medic. And the only medical training he had was through his wife, who was a nurse, who basically taught him what little medical stuff he knew. He was in the group that landed on Hacksaw Ridge in Okinawa. It was a pitched battle, a couple of days worth. And Desmond kept going out and finding a wounded soldier and bringing him back to the cliff. There were cliffs in Okinawa. And he rigged up a rope system around a tree and around his own body. And he put this little harness on each one of these soldiers. And he slowly let them down over the cliff. And at one point, he felt like he couldn't hear God's voice anymore. He was a religious man, a spiritual man. And then he heard the phrase, one more, one more. And he kept going back after those wounded soldiers. And that night and the next day, he recovered and let down 75 wounded soldiers down that cliff. His hands were almost rubbed raw from doing that. He too was wounded. In his worship of God, he realized that authentic worship calls us. What is he calling you to be and to do? Do you see something else on that bulletin? Right in the middle. What do you see? A cross. Authentic worship will bring you to the cross.